Leadership Story Talks, where we discuss the practices that engage, motivate, develop, retain, and attract people to businesses. We'll give you principles and tools based on real-world stories to leverage listening and storytelling to become a better leader and management professional. Leadership Story Talks is produced by Narrative, a company that focuses on personal storytelling for business.
Welcome to Leadership Story Talks. In this podcast, Julienne Ryan and I, Jerome DeRoy, discuss ways in which we can create more engagement in our lives, especially at work. There are more people today who identify as disengaged than there are who say they feel engaged at work. So we come from Narrative, which is a company that focuses specifically on engaging businesses and their audiences through the power of listening and storytelling. And we have a 7-step method that many of you are aware of to do so. Now, there are many ways to engage people, especially in leadership, and we became interested in speaking to people that could bring different perspectives and insights. And today we have such a guest, and I'm very, very happy to have him on the show. That's Niall Dunne. I'm going to give a little bit of an intro, and then I'll give him a chance to introduce himself as well. He currently serves as CEO of Polymateria out of Imperial College London, who includes the King of England as its notable investors. Its mission is to advance science to help nature deal with plastic pollution. Previously, Niall has worked in senior leadership roles in BT, Accenture, and Saatchi Saatchi. He's a World Economic Forum Young Global Leader. He's worked on WEF's Global Agenda Councils on sustainable consumption and climate change. An interesting personal note, he's been an athlete all his life and represented Ireland internationally as an 800-meter runner. And I know that Niall and Jules have a special connection, so I'm going to hand it over to you to give a slightly less formal introduction.
Yes, this is a different intro for today, and I have to give you a little background context in order to share it. My husband, Joe Ryan, is a Dublin Irishman who is a lifetime educator and a Hall of Fame track coach who worked for years at a small school called Manhattan College in the Bronx, New York. There he coached male and female sprinters to excellence on the national, collegiate, international, and a few went on to the Olympics. Conversations on a daily basis in our house was all about track and field and the pursuit of excellence. And then one day, many years ago, Joe announced, "I just recruited a young Irish guy and I think he has great potential. That young fella may just do something with himself." And then without further ado, today we're going to find out what happened and why since Niall left the Bronx. And with that said, I'm passing the mic back to Jerome. Thank you and welcome.
Thanks, Jules, and thanks, Niall, for being here. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Jerome. I think that's more a mic drop, Jules, than a pass of the mic. That was amazing. Thank you.
I know. That's why I didn't have too much to say after that intro. Yeah, it's great. Well, maybe we can start a little bit at the beginning here, and where I sort of ended my own kind of formal intro, and where Jules sort of started hers, and that connection with the world of sports, and how that leads us to what you then went on to do, and kind of this deep involvement in climate change and sort of global issues that the world is facing. So I'd love to maybe start with that. How do you go from being an athlete to where you are now?
Very easily. I was actually listening to Tim Brown, the founder of Allbirds, on the tube on the way in this morning, and the trajectory from athletics or team sports into business leadership. I think particularly the types of business that the world needs more of at this point in time. It's maybe a more trodden path than we might appreciate, because I think the principles of team sport, the pursuit of excellence and how you create high performance environments, and needing to have all of those complementary resources at your disposal, and optimizing absolutely everything, whether it's your nutritionists, your training partners, your psychologists, that team. The mistake we make, I think, in track and field is thinking that it's one person that's out there in front of us all. It's a collective effort in all instances. and I look back through my story, so many volunteers, so many men and women gave their time to me, and I really felt obligated standing on their shoulders to kind of make something of myself. So I think the scrappiness as well of being an Irish athlete, where not everything is handed to you. We don't have the big sponsors and the shiniest of tracksuits when we're on the kind of the global scene. You have to, really take a much more kind of resourceful approach to making your own luck. And yeah, I think the support of the Irish community, as just evidenced by Jules' introduction there, where we look after each other. I think the Irish diaspora on the global stage tends to do very well because, we integrate well, we buy into other cultures and very curious about what we can learn, what we can give. And my time at Manhattan College was exactly that. And I constantly say I got more out of that than anything I did in the classroom or any MBA program or any leadership program since then. So, it has been, I think, integral and in many ways the slingshot to everything that I've achieved in the last, 20, 30 years.
Wow, amazing. And what a great kind of origin story and taking us back. And I wonder, so in terms of that trajectory that we're talking about, what was there a sort of catalyst at any point that brought you to this? Because Polymateria is a fairly recent endeavor, I guess, if we look at it from the career perspective. But what was that trajectory that kind of got you to then becoming a CEO of a world, changing company in terms of how we deal with plastics and pollution, and what was the catalyst there? Because I know you worked with BT, Accenture, Saatchi and Saatchi. Was there one of those experiences that sort of led you on that path to say, instead of working for others, I will now take this on as my own, and I'll be responsible and accountable for it as a CEO?
I'm a great believer in synchronicity, and sometimes it's just the right time and time and opportunity catch up with you, and you may have been, it feels like standing in the same place trying to do the same thing over and over, but then angels show up in your life at a particular moment when you're really ready and unlock something that has a multiplier effect on you and everyone else around you. So for me, I've had a very long relationship with purpose, wanting to do something purposeful. I think I get that from sport. As a middle class white guy in Dublin in the 80s and 90s, you didn't drop out of college. I did. I worked in a cat food factory when all of my friends went to college, packing Whiskas cat food and Shamrock food and Dean's Grange. Jules is probably not going to even remember a time when we used to write personal checks to each other. And those checks would go into a clearinghouse and sort them, and they get processed by their banks. I would sort those checks from 10 o'clock at night till 2 a.m. And it was sport that kind of kept me sane through that period of my life. And it was around that time that Joe spotted some of the results I was getting in races, but it was always bigger than me. It was never about ego. I think maybe in the earlier days there was a lot more ego involved, but when you realize the limitations of that, and you have to have a bigger dream, you have to have something that allows you to want to stand on a global stage with Kenyans and Jamaicans and Americans and say, we belong, and we can inspire others like me to kind of follow this path. This is a tenable path. It's a great path. And when I then finished my track career and owed so much money, and my dad's were needed to get a real job, that sense of purpose then followed me into what I was going to do next. I was never going to be an accountant or just somebody who just did 9 to 5. I wanted to find purpose in the platform that I went onto. And it wasn't even called sustainability when I started. I went into Accenture. They used to be called Anderson Consulting because they practice change. And as an athlete, the thing you learn is you have to be changing yourself firstly and your environment all the time to optimize and find those, marginal gains. So I wanted to learn about that, and about halfway through my 10 years in there, it became risk management. There's all these risks we're not even thinking about. The banks aren't thinking about them. Insurance companies aren't thinking about them, and they're going to catch us out. And we created a risk management practice to deal with that, ahead of Lehman Brothers and ahead of a lot of the 2008 crisis. When you have that data and you start to scrutinize it, you say, well, gosh, why would we not be on the right side of history? Why would this not be in our products and our strategy and our brands and how we engage and win the war for talent? And that was the birth of the sustainability practice within Accenture. And I then went on from there to Saatchi and Saatchi, was about the power of brands and how can brands like Procter & Gamble, Toyota, we launched the Prius, Walmart on some, employee engagement work based largely on movement theory, linked to sustainability. And then ultimately BT, and BT was, I guess, my first, really big executive job. The chief sustainability officer there was, at board level responsibility, 2% of PBT, but it was about how does this drive the clean tech portfolio within BT from about £1 billion value when we started to about 3.2 billion by the time I left in 2017. But just around kind of timing and coming back to that point around, sometimes angels just find you in life. I watched David Attenborough's Blue Planet episode in October 2017, and I was really touched by that moment where the calf, the whale, baby whale, died because its stomach was so full of plastic. And that same episode broke the internet in China, and it certainly broke my heart back then. And I never really have bought anyone's explanation for how and when contagion happens. Sometimes stuff just catches fire, whether it's Coney 2012 or that particular episode of Blue Planet. He wasn't saying anything different than Greenpeace had been saying for 20 years, but that really caught on. And there was this populist response to plastic and demonizing it. And with my background, I was just standing there going, where's the innovation on this one? Where's the solar? Where's the Tesla? Where's the Impossible Foods or the Oatly or the thing we can point to? There was nothing. There was a lot of greenwash. And I'm just left with that. And also thinking, at BT, what do I do next? And it was around that time, through family friends, I met the founders of this business. They just wanted dinner. They just wanted a chat. They wanted advice. They had data that no one else had. They were, sat in the building I'm now in. And we started, just talking about how you scale a business like this. It's a very different P&L. It touches many of the points you framed in your introduction, where, you cannot put your head above the parapet and say we're going to solve that environmental issue and not have integrity as the foundation of everything you do, not because of any religious, Christian or other reasons, but because of the level of scrutiny you're going to endure. It's not a traditional P&L. So the culture has to really buy into the integrity, and then you're only as strong as your weakest link. And you have to have that almost athletic obsession with, what are we not thinking about? What do we not know? Where are we weak behaviorally, technically? What are we missing? Which is very prevalent in high-performing teams. And what that does is it drives diversity into your thinking in a very conscious and obvious way, because after a few years of doing that, you look back and realize, gosh, very few people in here look like me. They don't think like me either. And actually, it's the job of leadership to make all of that work in a way that is better than the sum of its parts. And then you got to punch above your weight. On these big global issues, you see the Teslas and the Oatlys and Patagonia and Allbirds, doing big things to show relentless alignment to mission that almost seem not to make financial sense, but unlock untold advocacy or regulation or consumer buy-in in a way that helps that trajectory and scalability. So over the last, Polymateria is only 7 years old. I joined January 2018. And, we've been working on all of those things for the last 5 years, which, brings us up to today.
Wow.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that background. And, fascinating for me to hear all the different strands that we started to talk about at the top of the show, but sort of bringing back, there's kind of three things, and I'd love to hear your, maybe elaborate a little bit on this, but three things that you seem to be doing very consciously. One is this idea of purpose, right? The purpose is very strong, and you follow that purpose and you kind of stay true to it. The second is that idea of integrity, I mean, and because maybe something that I hadn't thought about before meeting you, it's integrity. I think of integrity because of, just the way I walk in the world, right? Something happens and I'm going to stay true to my values, et cetera, in the face of something that could actually make me go another way, right? And so that's when I recognize that I have to be in integrity with that. But you mentioned this in the context also of, the scrutiny of others, and sort of having to be very strong in the face of that. That's the second thing that I got. And then the third was just around data and storytelling. Like you were saying, there wasn't a lot of data on this, and then there's this story that comes out. And for whatever reason, we don't know how contagion happens, but now the world is paying attention at some point, and we know that these things are fleeting, right? And so I wonder if you seem to be very conscious about purpose, integrity, data. I wonder if you're also conscious about, or look for, those kind of stories that can be catalysts. Do you sort of look for those moments, or is it more like an opportunity, in terms of, oh, wow, there's a story going on over there and nobody knows about it. Let's put that in front of people because that might move the needle more for us. Does that make sense to you, first of all? And
yeah, and I think that works best when it's collective. And I think, again, just with learning from others, and I think the great kind of interjection into our lives that podcasts have become, it's such an amazing way to hear from leaders and learn. Like I just mentioned that the Tim Brown Allbirds one, but there's so many others that we could reference, and out of each one of them I take something different. But we encourage within the business that collective self-actualization, because the challenges are different at different phases. And if you don't have that culture of curiosity and real honest introspection with what it really takes to be a high-performing environment, the questions we're asking now are very different when we were a startup. Like in a startup, you have that classic scrappy, you're just trying to keep the lights on. You're like that, barky Jack Russell that just wants to get noticed, and you are pushing a boulder up a hill, but you won't admit it to yourself. But at a certain point in time, your technology starts to really get noticed, and you become, and most Silicon Valley companies I kind of see stay there. They whether as big as Uber or some of the kind of the newer ones, that technology centric phase becomes something you can never get out of. And we were there from 2017 to 2020. We were obsessed with the technology. We saw the world through that technology lens. We wanted to prove it. We published peer-reviewed papers. We launched new standards, all because we thought this technology was the greatest thing. But that introspection and that real honesty around, kind of what does it really take to solve this problem, led us to, I think, realizing that's not going to scale. You gotta solve this one through your customers. And that same obsession with the technology had to become an obsession with our customers. And that was probably the biggest change, and probably the biggest challenge for most scale-ups, is transitioning out of technology-centric to customer-centric, because it's different mindsets, different processes, and in some cases, different people. Some of our people weren't able to make that shift, and you have to deal with that elegantly if you can, but sometimes you just got to rip the sticking plaster off. But as I look back over the last 12 months, the thing I'm proudest of is not the numbers, it's not the trajectory, it's not the kind of the global momentum. It's the culture. It's you know, what I feel in every one-to-one, what I hear, and knowing that there's a buy-in to those three things that you said: purpose, integrity, data. And they probably define it differently. But it's alive and well within the organization and constantly being nurtured by that curiosity. And I don't know what it is in 18 months or 3 years from now. I know we'll need to be different and evolving and changing. And we'll only figure that out by that introspection happening together, and each of those new hires or new behaviors that we recruit or build, feeding that introspection.
So I want to make a comment here that I think it's so interesting. You had all these thoughts in mind when you were in your BT experience and what you were working on, and that the next stage came because you agreed to listen. And you suspend and spend some time with this group that I don't know how much you knew about them, and really take time to listen. Now, what I'd love to hear a little bit more, because you're giving all these great contexts about how you're working, is maybe just a soundbite of what your business is and how you build the model and the framework, because I think it's quite interesting, this three-part approach to your work.
So the first point is purpose and being mission driven. And it's a huge difference to retrofit a purpose into established Fortune 500 or FTSE company, where you're trying to almost go back and remember what was the initial idea 100 years ago. We don't have that. We're purpose built from the ground up to solve a very specific problem that links to Jerome's third point, which is data driven. There's science coursing through the veins of this organization. I'm one of the few people without a PhD. We're sat here in Imperial Innovations, which is, probably the top molecular science ecosystem in Europe, certainly. And working back from the problem is so important to be truly purposeful. So 32% of all plastic winds up in nature every year. When the business was set up in 2015, the world produced 315 million tons of plastic. All of our work to become more aware and everything Attenborough has done, next year we'll probably break through 400 million tons. It's not even touching the sides in terms of that train is a runaway train. So you have to come at the problem from really understanding it to the point where it's slapping you in the face and keeping you awake at night. So what's interesting about the material flow is that 31% of it is a material called polyolefins, the stuff that winds up outside. So we focus there first. And also, whilst the focus is on the oceans, the biggest problem is on land. 80% of all plastic gets to the ocean from land. So our theory of change is, what if we created something that changed the very nature of plastic? So the issue again is because it's so persistent. All plastic becomes macroplastic and then microplastic and then nanoplastic. It's ubiquitous. It's literally in us and our and nature. So what we figured out is how can we change it to be perishable? And in order to allow for its usefulness, its utility, we time control it. So we allow for it to be used and reused and ideally recycled, and we can program the exact month within which the technology becomes active. And then what we've uniquely figured out is how at that point do we make it effectively self-destruct, so get it back to nature. We're the only company in the world that's done that for polyolefins on land, and published our peer-reviewed papers and launched new standards to prove it on very obvious things, like when you do this, you shouldn't create microplastic, you shouldn't harm nature. What you do in a lab should reflect the real world. All of that needed new standards, new rigorous pass-fail criteria. And we'd made a decision, again, being mission-driven, to open source our IP and create those new goalposts so that legislators and industry could make better decisions around what they should ban and what they should give exemptions to. And that standard that we launched is now being used in 13 different countries all around the world. That was born out of the technology-centric phase of the business that I was talking about. We brought someone in from Tesla to run that program for us, because we wanted that kind of campaigning, disruptive, challenging mindset in how we were taking that standard out into the world, and creating those outcomes that should create a much more science-based playing field that everybody has to live by. So, you know, the alignment with purpose and kind of doing big things to kind of shake up the system, and doing that all based on science, but that profound understanding of, you know, data and where the problem is biggest, you know, all of that fits together, you know, really clearly in our strategy.
Mm-hmm.
Thank
How
you.
does yeah, thanks so much for that. You know, I wonder about one thing, in terms of, and you alluded to this a little bit earlier, but how does diversity come into something like this, or you know, such an enterprise where it is about the world, and you know, now you're talking about 13 different countries globally. I would imagine the cultures in those countries are different, and the approach perhaps to plastic and the environment, I would imagine, is different everywhere. And so how do you approach diversity with that in mind? Because, you know, I think we hear so much about diversity, and unfortunately a lot of it is kind of lip service. At least here in the US, you know, there was a kind of clear breaking point with the George Floyd murder, and then after that, you know, kind of social upheaval, and many Fortune 500 companies, you know, started to say, we're really looking at this issue very seriously. And but, you know, you don't really know a couple of years later, you know, how is that really looked at very seriously, other than naming someone to that post. And so I wonder, for you, with an enterprise that is so, you know, global, and looking at an issue that concerns every single one of us, how do you approach diversity in terms of your employees, but also, you know, maybe I'm assuming there's some kind of educational approach to what you have to do in terms of bringing this to the world, where maybe there's some resistance, and you know, yeah, I'm curious about that aspect of things.
It's inevitable when you live and ultimately work and die in an environment that is so intense in terms of its accountability, and you're so connected to the outcome, and you therefore are obsessed about performance and what does it really take to become a high performing organization solving this 100 million ton per annum problem. That's what it is. You're led not the way most people think about diversity, which is we need to tick a box. We need a certain quota, or we need, optically, this doesn't look good if everybody looks like, you know, too Western or too Irish or whatever. That's CSR. It's putting a plaster on the problem. This is uniquely about performance, and you only get to really punch above your weight and solve these big problems by pulling in those unique, diverse perspectives, those you know, insights, behaviors, geographical positions that give you context that you're going to miss. And we're obsessed about our blind side, because, you know, just to use a linebacker analogy, it's that, you know, lack of peripheral vision. That's the thing's going to kill your quarterback. It's that guy that gets around you. So always obsessing about the blind side, the thing we don't know. And you do that long enough and consistent enough, and when you see the benefit of it, it's brilliant. I've sat in 3 meetings today where it was the voice that no one expected to show up at a regulatory meeting on Malaysia, and a lab technician gave us an insight no one else was thinking about. I had a brand position preparing for a kind of a co-branding workshop with one of the kind of the major FMCGs in the world, and it was a technical person that inputted into a creative meeting with something no one else was thinking about. I'm constantly seeing those diverse perspectives. It could be somebody who we've hired just in India or in China, or, you know, a lab technician that's like 3 weeks out of college, and encouraging that voice to speak up, to cover the blind side. That's the key to performance, you know. And I think the more cookie cutter we are, the more samey we are, the sooner you're going to get found out, you know. And I think the sooner you're going to be an Uber and a Travis Kalanick, or a Tyrannos and an Elizabeth Holmes, you're not going to have those voices speaking up and saying it doesn't work, or we're missing this, or what the customer or the government are really going to want to know is X, Y, and Z. You know, we have a lady that works for us called Celine Moriera, and we've promoted Celine 3 times in 3 years, because when Celine was 3 weeks with us, we had £50,000 in the bank account, and you're in that startup position where do we pay our people or do we pay our suppliers? That's very sobering when you're in that moment. And we had some high net worth individuals coming into us from I guess Monaco, you know, and they were going to make all our problems go away. And Celine stopped them at the door of our laboratories, and our laboratories like 10% the size that they are now back then. And she said, "I'm sorry, I can't let you into our labs. You can't bring your coffee in." And that they had some, you know, skinny latte or something. And very embarrassingly, from our founders' perspective, they had to leave the coffees at the door, and then Celine brought them in and gave them a brilliant tour. And I was sat down afterwards and told, "You put it all at risk. Like, that's, you know, who is that person? You cannot, that can never happen again." And I said the exact opposite. That is ground zero for this business. That's what we build around. That's the future of this organization. Because if we never take a backward step, and the little things like you do not bring a cup of coffee in the labs, I've seen Celine and so many others show up for us. That's also the person that will never take the ethical shortcut. They won't, give a third-party report on a piece of data or a science research project that isn't completely accurate and true. And I've seen that particularly when we launched the standard, where we came face to face with the biggest chemical company in the world, who, like Shark Tank, were just circling us, trying to find the weaknesses and where can we challenge this, where are the assumptions, to have what's called a material objection, so that the standard couldn't be launched because they'd backed a different horse. And because we'd never taken a backward step on integrity, from the moment Celine stopped those high net worth individuals walking into our labs to that point in time, about 3.5 years later, there was no weaknesses in the standard. There was nothing that the largest chemical company in the world could attack, and the standard got launched, and it's now used in 13 different countries all around the world. So no one can tell me that diversity isn't about performance, that it isn't about that voice, that person that, you know, has real power the minute they use their voice. If you back them and you encourage that, you know, it is the key. It's the thing that, you know, ultimately you'll get found out. But if you're interested in something that can be infinitely scalable and successful in many countries and many territories all around the world, you have to take diversity strategically seriously, not serious from a HR perspective, strategically seriously.
Yeah. You know, I've been nodding a lot because you embody so much of the beliefs that we have in terms of storytelling and listening in particular, when it comes to leadership, and how do we listen and how do we tell stories in that context. And that's a lot of our work, and hearing you speak and telling that story about Celine, you know, one thing that really jumps out at me is that it completely embodies integrity. And I think, you know, when you have a story that actually backs up what you say, then you are much more believable, and people are going to trust you a lot more because you've got the evidence. It's like the story becomes data almost when we talk about things like integrity and purpose. And that's a lot of you know, what we communicate to our clients and people we work with. But the thing I wanted to point out is that there must have been no doubt in Celine's mind that for her to say that to those people 3 weeks into her job, and to say, you know, put down your coffee, you can't come into the lab with that, even knowing all the background and, you know, knowing what was at stake, that you had her back, that as a leader, you know, you must have given something because of, I mean, and I get this from who you are now and all of these insights that you got from all these other experiences that you've had around leadership and trust and integrity. I mean, my guess is that you don't have to say much for people to understand that from you, that's something you live and breathe. And one of the things that I've noticed with a lot of people that we work with is that some people will refrain from doing what Celine did because they don't feel like they have permission to do so from their leadership or from the culture at large of the company itself. Not because no one said you can't do that, but just because it's not part of that culture. It's not there. It's not being lived and breathed. I wonder if does that sound true to you, that was it 100% Celine and her personality and her own kind of wherewithal to say, no, I'm going to stick to my beliefs here. Is there also a part that you think might have played a role in that decision that she made in the moment, even if she wasn't aware of it, but that's just part of that culture that you've been describing to us?
I think in that instance, we got lucky. It was her bravery and her the background and her story to get to that point in time, from Johannesburg through Portugal, and how, you know, she's just made her life happen, you know, in spite of the system, and busted through every ceiling, you know, on the way to where she is now. And, you know, you watch, you've got another Carla Harris on your hands there. But, you know, to use another Carla Harris analogy, I've had Celine's back ever since then, because, you know, I've realized that, you know, you as a leader are only judged by your ability to create other leaders, and you know, carrying someone's papers, as Carla Harris would say, who carries your papers, who's having those discussions for you in the room when you're not there. Celine is one example, but we're lucky to have many others, because we've continued to narrate and storytell and not hide that, you know, under a bushel, but make sure our people are aware of it. So, you know, particularly in trickier markets, you know, maybe some Eastern European markets, or, you know, even closer to home, you know, where people expect you to do something unethical. It's like you're told it's the norm. It's not the norm. You know, you win every day. You don't do that. You know, you don't win when you become a clean tech unicorn and you ultimately solve the problem. You win every day when you do the right thing. And I think that story within the business and celebrating that. And I speak, you know, Imperial Business School, I speak to the MBA cohort there, day one every year. And I tell Celine's story as part of our story. And Celine's going to do the MBA next year. It's going to be a bit embarrassing because she's going to be sat in the class. And I'd be like, okay, don't hear it from me. Have Celine tell the story. But continuing to recite that has been so important, because that creates gravity in the organization, where your point, Jerome, that, yeah, maybe that first instances, we just got lucky because we have a naturally gifted leader. And I think probably realizing in thinking about this business and how it, you know, what's the spine of this organization, what's the soul of this organization, what's the heart of it, to build around the right people and the right values, not the wrong people and the wrong values. And then you got to back them, because when you take young people and you put them in roles with huge responsibility, huge expectation, it can be crushing. And you're going to have your work cut out being there for them through that pressure, in those difficult moments, through those crucibles. It's going to take a lot out of you, and they may not make it. So, you know, diversity is also youth. It's, you know, giving youth a chance, giving them the resources, giving them the platform, but recognizing they won't have the experience that you or I have, but they'll do things that don't mirror the cookie cutter. But we don't want the same. We don't want what we had for 100 years. We want something different. So if we believe in that, we're going to give younger people a chance. That's part of diversity too. We're going to give them the resources, and they're going to mess up. And we have quite a few of those in the last 12 months, backing our younger people, giving them resources, giving them budgets. And, you know, you have to really have their papers in those moments, because you know, the coaching and the mentorship can close some of the gaps, not all of the gaps. And some will just decide, you know what, this just isn't for us, and that's okay too.
Yeah.
When you're talking and you're using Celine the example, and it's like one of those microsecond moments too. It's not like a long thing, about how integrity shows up in small but important things. So not so small from the big picture, but when she made a decision to recognize that and scan the environment, somebody else might be paying attention and just say, well, that should be normal. But to call it out and have the power to use your voice and pay attention, I think that's where the diversity of thought comes, to use different lenses to scan the environment. It's easier to say, well, if you have a bag of money sitting on your doorstep, that should be a sign you don't take it. But these are moments of integrity to make sure you had everything above board and according to your standards and your rules and what you needed to do. So I think that is a great story to teach people.
I think if there's ever a box set or a movie made about Polymateria, it'll be something around, you know, from that cup of coffee left sitting outside going cold in that laboratory through to BASF, and how, you know, you were able to undergo that intense scrutiny from their lead scientist to the culture that we've kind of created here in the last 12 months. I think that, you know, is your point, Jules. It's like that small, seemingly inconsequential action, you know, and then following through and backing that each and every day, you know, in our science, in our culture, in who we partner with, ethically, how we show up, and also having zero tolerance on it, you know, because there has been moments where it's been suggested, hinted, maybe if we did this, that, and you know, I've said, look, if that person approaches me to even ask that question, it's terminal for the relationship, and you need to tell them that that's the case. And if that even gets floated, I cannot ever work with them again. And you only need to say that once, and word just gets out that, you know, we do not take a backward step when it comes to doing the right thing.
Good.
And why would we?
What a great we have to, I'm looking at the time and it's just flown by, and it's been such a pleasure. And so I have to think about landing this plane now. But before we move on to concluding, I wonder, there's a question that we ask of all of our guests, and you may have sort of gone through this already because we've gone through many of your experiences, but is there an experience that you can think of and tell us a little bit about that you feel still shapes who you are today, or has shaped who you are today and still informs you?
Yeah, I think it goes back to New York, and you know, leaving Ireland to go to Manhattan, and you know, giving everything to that, you know, period of time. I think when New York was, you know, the Rome of its day, and there was a confidence and a swagger to New York in the mid to late 90s that you just felt like anything was possible. And I wound up washed up on the rocks. Like, I blew out my hip from running in the garden in the armory, at a stress fracture to the femoral neck. And, you know, I was really struggling with my keeping my scholarship, keeping engaged in the program. I wasn't my best self. And I was hobbling around in crutches at a basketball game. It was a commemorative game for Earl the Goat Manigault, the goat. And this guy came up to me and he just said, "Oh, what's happened to you, kid?" And I said, "You don't want to know, don't want to bore you with the details, but basically I've got a stress fracture to the femoral neck, and I just got an MRI up at the hospital by where Joe and Jules live, and I was able to describe in great detail the impact injury that I had received." And he kind of nodded his head and he said, "Oh, I see that all the time." I said, "Really?" And he goes, "Yeah." He says, "I work with the dancers in the Broadway shows, and they get a lot of those type of impact injuries in the foot, in the knee, and in the hip." And he later revealed himself to be a guy called Dr. Thomas Spiridelis. And I'm a
Tom, yes.
Yeah, I'm a scholarship student in New York, and I know this guy is, you know, legendary. So I said, "Oh, wow, you know, he works on Donna Karan, or did back then, and you know, was you know, had a practice in the 72nd and West Manhattan." And I said, "Well, you know, you've seen it all the time." And he said, "Yeah." He says, "I can help you." And I said, "Well, I can't afford you." I said, "I don't have any insurance. You know, we don't have the budget at Manhattan to." And he says, "That's okay. Can you answer the phone?" And I said, "Of course I can answer a phone." And he said, well, he says, I need a receptionist. Could you be my receptionist? No problem. I'll be your receptionist. So I hobbled down after classes every day from the Bronx to Upper West Side. And I sat there very badly, I might add, booking in his appointments. And the last patient would go home. Tom would work on me for 60 minutes, 90 minutes, all pro bono, and basically put me back together. Bloodless surgery is what he called it. Rolfing. Wow. You basically get into the tissue of the abdomen and the all around the hip pointer, hip flexor muscles. You rip apart the scar tissue and you basically put it back together through rehab. And it's very, very painful, leaves a lot of bruising on you. But after 6 to 9 months of that, I went from being told I'd possibly never run again, used my scholarship to January 24th, 1998, running the 3rd fastest time in the world against Johnny Gray, only collegiate athlete to kind of push. He was then the fastest American ever over 800 meters in Harvard, and felt then the power of angels in our lives, felt that it is that, stranger that has that gift to give, that if you're open and really are, honest about what it is you stand for, what it is you believe in, they show up. He showed up for me then, and so many other people, Joe Ryan is one of them, have showed up. There's so much goodwill, in the world when you are really trying to do the right thing, not getting it right, failing, on your knees, suffering. They're out there. They'll show up for you. So you have to be conscious when you're that for someone else. You have to be conscious when you're being required to carry somebody else's papers and fight for them in the room when they're not there.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. What a moving and inspiring way to end this episode, and I could go on, and I'm just very, very thankful for this connection that was made all those years ago between you and Joe and Jules, and very thankful to you, Jules, for introducing me to Neil and making this whole thing happen. I think our listeners are going to be very there's just a ton of advice and insights, and coming back to this idea of just how important it is to figure out what it is that you stand for, and show up for that, and show up for others. That word angels is one that's gonna stick for me, and one that I will now, from now on, work to recognize those angels and acknowledge them, and then see when I can be that for somebody else. I think that's great and very inspiring for me. So thank you so much. Is there anything, Neil, that you would want to point people to? I don't know, a website, resources, maybe a podcast that you love. You mentioned one podcast that you were listening to on your way over here.
Yeah, so on the business itself, firstly, you'll see it in stadiums, sports events, festivals. We focus there. I've started in Puerto Rico with Afro Nation back last year, did Twickenham rugby events, festivals. We'll be doing Rajasthan Royals in India, but you can see it all through lifecycle.com, and it's lifecycle with a Y. And the why is because young people are at the heart of driving the change. We want to make this for them. So that the B2B brand Polymateria is, deep tech, very sciencey, but the campaign, the movement is called Life Cycle. And that's all about the power of young people and connecting the technology to them and inspiring and kind of driving their action. So if anybody wants to learn more, or if you have events, festivals that, you'd love to use our technology for, check out lifecycle.com.
Great.
And then, the Tim Brown, that was the Stanford Entrepreneurial Thought Leaders series that they were interviewing Tim Brown, and I'll include that podcast as well. And then just maybe on some of the thoughts around diversity and inclusion as well. I'll add additional link there too.
Great, fantastic. Well, thank you so much, and thanks, Jules, to you for making this connection again.
Thank you.
Any parting words? Yeah.
Thank you, Neil, for the gift of time. And it just shows when you have purpose and you want to build community, beautiful things that can happen. So we are on a mission to do that with our podcast. So stay connected. This is not just one and done. All right. Till the next time.
Thanks so much,
guys.
Jules. Yeah, thanks, Neil, and thanks to all our listeners for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a review on your favorite podcast platform, as that's what drives the word of mouth. As always, you can visit our website, narrative.com, for more information on the podcast. We also have a blog post with lots of resources and insights. It's all free, and you can find out how you can find, craft, and present the stories and really give you a sense of purpose, borrowing from Neil's language here. And, he's ready to listen to you. So thanks for listening. Thank you all, and we will see you next time.
For more information on the narrative listening and storytelling method and how it can help your business, go to narrative.com.